Good afternoon. I'm going to start with a confession. I'm a proud public educator. I've worked on most of the wrong stuff in my career for most of the years I've worked in public education. And spent a lot of time in the world of curriculum and instruction and assessment, particularly as a central office administrator. And those things actually don't matter all that much. So about maybe 10 years ago, I started to think a little differently about, what should schools be influencing? Where should we be putting our energy as school systems? And I realized I had a pretty ingrained pattern of deficit thinking. So I'm a big fan of No Child Left Behind. I believe No Child Left Behind forced us, really for the first time as public educators. I actually started teaching prior to standardized testing. I'm that old. But it forced us to really look at who we weren't serving. We've heard a lot of those stories already today. And I think that was a great impact. I think collateral impact was we started to think about then what do we do for all those kids who don't have the test scores that we want, because that's what we get beat up in the paper. And you see states like Louisiana and lots of other states providing report cards, and sometimes they include growth metrics like being pointed out, and sometimes they don't. So what really matters then, if it's not all the work that we do around curriculum, instruction, and assessment? Three other things, in my opinion. Probably two of those things are a TED Talk, maybe for a different day. But let's start with school and kids, birth to 18. So if every kid were to attend school 180 days and they were engaged in learning for the entire 8-hour span that they graced a school campus, from birth to 18, that'd be about 9% of their life. Those are pretty generous estimates. So we work really hard in public schools around trying to make big differences with that 9% of the time that we have. And the discourse around public schools aren't what they should be, really isn't very productive. In reality, when you scratch under the surface, most of our kids make a year's growth in a year's time in most of our schools in the country. So to make the argument that we have failing schools and this and that and the other thing really isn't very productive. Let's scratch under the surface of what might be more productive, how we might, as school personnel, influence the other 91% of a kid's time, which may make a bigger difference. So school matters. The high school diploma is really the gateway in our society in terms of whether you're a net giver or a net taker from the social safety net. And as a result of those things, we do all kinds of things. We perseverate on graduation rates. My gosh, could you think of a more lagging indicator for a school system than graduation rates? So we're generally looking at the wrong data. And teachers matter. And I don't want anybody to walk away thinking that I don't think teachers matter, but teachers are the maraschino cherry on the sundae that kids bring to the table. So I said about 7, 8, 9 years ago, I started thinking differently around, well, if I'm going to get my mind out of the deficit gutter, and I want to think about how can we ensure more of our kids are successful? And what does that even mean? I started thinking about, actually, I'm a myopic individual, probably like most everyone in the room. I started thinking about my own children, my own 2 children. My wife is also a public educator. Volitionally stayed home for 7 years during the time my 2 kids were between birth and 5 and birth and 7, respectively. My kids went to school as a result of that advantage, being able to read, being able to attend, being able to facilitate getting along with other people. They were ready for school. What we know about kids that are ready for school, no matter what school they go to, no matter what school system they go to, and defining ready by both the academic side of it and, more importantly, the get along with people side of it. Most of us don't lose our jobs because we don't have the capacity to do our jobs. We actually lose our jobs because we can't get along with people that we work with. So both of those things are really important. You're a tremendous outlier if you show up to kindergarten in any school system with the readiness skills that you need and somehow you fail. That doesn't happen. You're a tremendous outlier if you show up both socially and academically in the bottom quartile if somehow you succeed. And we buy all kinds of homes and gerrymander boundaries, and we try to get into schools we try to get our kids into schools that we perceive are better schools. And the reality is Whatever happened before that kid got to school probably is a bigger indicator than anything we'll do in any given school in terms of how they ultimately succeed. So policymakers are concerned about all this stuff. They make us look at graduation rates. We take standardized tests. And all this is really expensive and not nearly as productive as it could be. That's probably a different TED Talk on a different day. So how do we miss the point? Really the mismatch in our educational outcomes in our kids in terms of current approaches and what actually works. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The good news is there is consensus about what matters, about what works, and the solutions are achievable. They're cost-effective, and they actually provide a handsome return on investment. Intrigued? So whether you sit on the right side or the left side of the spectrum, it's good for people and a return on investment, something we could probably all get behind. So are the solutions evaluating teachers and principals to excellence, labeling schools, making kids take standardized tests that are culturally biased and don't make sense to a lot of them anyway, or they're just flat boring, so I'm not sure what they measure. Are the solutions rooted in elegant pedagogy, in driving instruction, or a million other options? Well, in a word, no. The reality is, we talked about where kids start, that's where kids finish. And all of our schools do about the same job in that regard. Depending on the neighborhood you live in, you have a lot of kids that start behind versus a lot of kids who don't. And we talked about the buying houses. Doesn't matter the teacher one gets, yes, to some degree, but it still isn't anywhere near the biggest factor. There are a couple other factors that really matter. Again, I think probably pretty good TED Talks for different days. One being meeting the family where they're at and building on the assets of the family to really stabilize the family unit. The more stable a kid's home environment is, the more successful that kid's going to be. So we see that as outside of our jurisdiction oftentimes in public school. Can't be outside of our jurisdiction any longer. I think the other thing is we're learning all the time about, and again, read chapter 9 of Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and you'll see in the Baltimore public schools, every kid makes a year's growth in a year's time. The problem is they start at the age of 5 in kindergarten at roughly functioning as 3-year-olds cognitively and socially, or functioning as 8-year-olds cognitively and socially. So schools get kids to make a year's growth in a year's time. They don't start at the same place. And then we've got this thing. There's a couple of great little 2-minute YouTube videos on the summer slide. Some of you have probably seen some of those things. So some kids actually continue to grow in the summer, so they make more than a year's growth. If I start like my daughter did, really cognitively at the age of 8, and I make more than a year's growth in a year's time because of what I'm able to do in those months of June, July, and August, and who I happen to have been born to, we're making a lot more progress than the kid that doesn't have those options. So again, as a principal, I was one of those deficit principals who I couldn't figure out why we couldn't get those kids that didn't like school to come and do that drill and kill summer school so we could pound more skills into the kids. First of all, they didn't want to come. And if they had been successful in the first 9 months in learning those skills, they probably would have done so already. So what we were learning is those experiential activities that kids in the middle and upper class have access to in June, July, and August really make a difference. So if that makes a difference, if seeing the family as a unit that we can support, meet where they're at, and help stabilize, those still aren't the two biggest things, but they matter. So what matters most is intervention before the goose is cooked. So economists, neurologists, and other docs and educators, we all know that the first 36 months of a human life are the most important months, that there are things that happen developmentally in the brain. I'm not a neurologist. I know a little bit about it, but I won't get into it because there'd be people out here that could correct me, I'm sure. But the bottom line is there's windows that open in the first 36 months that don't open again or don't open again efficiently. And so if we're not working to influence the outcome of every child birth to 5, particularly birth to 3, we're serving a whole bunch of kids whose geese might proverbially be cooked. And we see that oftentimes as, well, it's outside of our jurisdiction. Aren't there a whole bunch of other systems taking a look at how we might do that work better? And yeah, the reality is yes. So how would we get more efficient at doing that community at a time? Some of the things that have really resonated with me in the earlier talks are transformation begins within. These are problems that we solve organically in local communities. They're not something we wait for our state and federal legislators to fix on our behalf. Well, I suppose we could, but I watch CNN probably too much. And we know that for every kid who comes to school ready, we know it from numerous studies. James Heckman actually won a Nobel Prize. He's an economist who looked at this thing and said, wow, this early learning thing, really, there's a lot of return on investment in this early learning thing. In fact, it's 7 to 10% per year you're alive over the course of your lifetime if you were invested in those first 36 to 60 months. So 7 to 10% ROI is something we can literally take to the bank. So our goal should be to help every kid get ready for school. And how do we do that? I think there are really 3 basic saturation points that any community, if motivated enough, could probably work through. One being our medical doctors. We know that almost all children, parents care about their kids. Almost all children make well kid checkups in those first 5 years. So doctors using programs like Reach Out and Read, using literature as milestone, make a huge difference. We've got evidence basis around this. We don't have every pediatrician and GP in the state of Washington accessing that program or a similar program, and we should. It cuts into the doc's profit margins, and medicine, like everything else in our country, is a tough business. So it's incumbent on communities to look at how they can partner with the medical community to make that a richer reality. The second piece is, who cares for our children? Policymakers live in the same bubble I live in, and we assume that, we make lots of assumptions. The bottom line is 7% of our kids across the country, give or take, come from a home where you have 2 bio parents and you have somebody who volitionally stayed home for a good chunk of time during their formative years. So 93% of our kids come from a different reality. We have to acknowledge that. And another way through that is making sure that there are tight networks with our early care and learning providers. They're hammered by regulations, particularly in our state, both around personal certification and around physical site certification. And the thing is, we're talking about people with varying degrees of education level who are working 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. in general, and then they've got to make sure that they're meeting muster both in terms of site specifications as well as their own professional development. School systems in particular, as well as other community organizations, can really streamline that piece, provide access and technical assistance to early care and learning providers at hours that work for them. And we have a huge chunk of kids in any community who are getting a lot of their needs met or not met in those environments. So schools and other organizations can collaborate with our early learning providers. They are hungry. Our early learning providers are hungry for these opportunities, and they're happy to participate. The third opportunity is a little more complex. We've got to make sure that somehow as a community we get in the home of every single family, friend, and neighbor situation where kids are, so that we make sure that parents at least have access, parents, caregivers have access to the meaningful types of resources that will really help lever things along, and connecting families to those resources and assets is the trickiest of the 3, but there's an awful lot that we can do. So the question isn't, is the work worth doing, or can it be done? The scope, the scale, and the resources are not beyond any community's capacity. We have the research. We have the consensus of the economic, medical, and educational communities on how to best do this work. The real question is, will a small group of committed champions emerge from the Wenatchee Valley, or any community for that matter, to make this place, the next great place for the next generation? Thank you.